Framtíðarbók. Gjöf til framtíðar. KB banki.
Vafalítið hægt að fullyrða að Milton Friedman sé þekktasti hagfræðingur sem nú uppi. Friedman var lengi kennari við háskólann í Chicago. Hann öðlaðist heimsfrægð árið 1976 honum voru veitt Nóbelsverðlaunin í hagfræði en þau fékk hann meðal annars fyrir rannsóknir sínar á neysluhegðun og peningamagnsþróun. Ef til vill á Friedman almenna fræð sína meira þakka frjálshyggju stjórnmálaskoðunum sínum en hagfræði en frjálshyggju stjórnmálaskoðunum sínar hefur hann sett fram í bókum og sjónvarpsþáttum en hluti sjónvarpsþáttanna var sýndur hér í íslenska sjónvarpinu fyrir nokkrum árum. Jafnframt því að vera frægur Friedman og mjög umdeildur og sýnist sitt hverjum ágæti þeirrar efnahagsstefnu sem fylgt hefur verið í löndum á borð við Chile og af stjórnum Thatchers í Bretlandi og Reagans í Bandaríkjunum en Friedman og kenningar hans hafa haft veruleg áhrif á stefnu stjórnenda þessara landa. Alla þessa þætti munum við ræða við Friedman í kvöld og umræðurnar munu fara fram á ensku. To discuss Friedman's theories, policies and field questions tonight we have three men who have been or are university teachers. Birgir Björn Sigurjónsson at the Economics Department of the University of Stockholm, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson at the University of Iceland in the Department of Political Science and Stefán Ólafsson also at the University of Iceland in the Department of Sociology. The rules of the engagement are that we would like you to be as brief as possible so we can cover as much as possible. But before we open up for general discussion and questions, I would like to ask you, Professor Friedman, to give us a brief outline of what you see as the ideal society, your personal utopia, if you would like.
Well, my personal utopia is one which takes the individual, or the family, if you will, as the key element in society. I would like to see a society in which individuals have the maximum freedom to pursue their own objectives in whichever direction they wish, so long as they don't interfere with the rights of others to do the same thing. In such a society, I believe you do need a government, but the government has a very limited role. Its role should be to provide for the national defense, to provide for protecting one individual from coercion by other individuals, and finally to provide a mechanism whereby we can formulate the rules that will govern us, the rules that decide what we regard as private property, what we regard as the rights of individuals, legislative process, and as part of that, a mechanism for judging differences of opinion. So you would have essentially in my good society a very limited government devoted to the tasks of defense, of justice, of legislating rules, and very little else. Mm-hmm. The rest would be left to the free individual activities of individuals joined together through the operation of a private and competitive market.
At the moment we have, in your opinion, I guess anyway, too big a government and very far from the ideal society which you have described. Which would be the best way to realize that dream?
There is only one effective way to do so, and that is by democratic means, by allowing the people to express their views. I have been fascinated by the fact that in country after country you have a paradox. You have what is supposed to be a government of the majority. You have a representative government. And yet that government repeatedly does things that a majority of the people oppose. You go around in the United States, for example, where I know the situation best, and you will find that a majority of the people in the United States think government is spending too much, imposing taxes that are too high, and would like to see government cut back. At the same time, the representatives of the people, through the parliament, through what we call the Congress, you call the Parliament, follow policies which lead to those results that the majority deplore. The reason for that, I believe, is that we have a defect in our governmental institutions. what we have is a situation in which minorities, special interest minorities, are able to exercise undue influence. In my opinion, so far as the United States is concerned, our solution to that is going to be through public action, which will lead to constitutional provisions setting narrower limits on government. That was a device that was adopted in the 18th century by the founders of our country in the original Constitution. And we need to reinforce that, in my opinion, by using the Constitution to set narrower limits on the scope of government.
If we turn now to the economics theories, Birgir Björn.
Well, we had in mind to start this discussion with some question of pure theoretical kind, and then proceed towards more economic policy questions and so on. I recall an article or a lecture given by Professor Hahn from Cambridge at the London School of Economics, where he does not agree that the quantity theorist model passes through what you might call the normal requirements of a modern economic theory. This does mean that he disqualifies the modern theorist standpoint of the monetary school just on the same grounds as the old quantity theory school. What is your reaction to this interpretation of Professor Hahn's position?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that in detail because I haven't read Frank Hahn's lecture that you're referring to. But the position in general reflects a split that has occurred among economic theorists for at least a century. It's a split. I wrote an article many years ago on Walras, in which I drew a distinction between Walrasian economics and Marshallian economics. The Walrasian view is that you have to have a general system of economics, a general equilibrium system, which will reflect all of the interrelations in the society in one system of simultaneous equations. It's very hard to talk about it without talking about it in a fairly technical sense. It's a general equilibrium system. Hahn is in that tradition. Alfred Marshall, who was a great economist at Cambridge in the 19th century, one of the most important economists who ever lived, had a very different view. His view was that economics should be an engine of analysis, that the purpose of economists is to consider problems and try to construct tools with which they can analyze concrete problems and reach conclusions about the consequences of that. Now, in order to do that, you have to simplify. You can't consider the world as a whole. You have to narrow and concentrate on one particular segment. That's what I call the Marshallian approach to economics. I personally have always regarded myself as a Marshallian and not a Walrasian. I think the general equilibrium system is a beautiful work of art. I think it is very valuable for students to learn it, to get a feeling about the interrelationships of things. But there is no way in which it can be used in practice to effectively to analyze specific problems. And so I have been inclined to view economics as the task of constructing an engine of analysis. From that point of view, both what you call the earlier quantity theory and the modern quantity theory, which are really the same thing. It's not really a different thing, it's a development, a further development of it. From that point of view, I believe those are effective engines of analysis. They deal with a particular problem. The quantity theory is not a general theory. It doesn't tell you very much about what the price of fish is going to be. It tells you a great deal about what the price level of all things on the average will be. It tells you a great deal about what the monetary circulation will be. And I have been inclined to view the quantity theory from that point of view as an engine of analysis, and from that point of view, I believe there is no economic theory for which there is a greater amount of empirical evidence justifying and supporting its main propositions.
Yes. Well, this was a very large answer, or strong refutation of this position.
It's no refutation. Don't misunderstand me. I think the world benefits from differences of opinion.
Yes.
I am delighted to have people like Frankie Hahn and other people like that because they develop ideas and approaches which other people can take up in other ways. So I'm not criticizing him. I'm only saying he's choosing to concentrate in one area. I'm choosing to concentrate in another.
Should we take that to mean as that your theories are not necessarily right, but just one of many theories which goes to make of the whole mind of ideas?
That's a different thing. No theory is necessarily right. In the world of science, nobody can be positive. Science consists, whether it's physical science or economic science, it consists always of a set of hypotheses, which are accepted because they seem to fit the facts to date. But somebody may come along and find a new set of facts.
And until they can be disproven.
The Newtonian theory is succeeded by the Einsteinian theory.
But to take that up to the specific example of your own theories, as you were just saying, the validity of theories is found in how well they will fit empirical tests.
Absolutely.
Quite recently, the Bank of England published a research by Professor Henry in England, in which he runs your most recent work on Britain and America through the rigorous tests of modern economic statistics. And he finds out that they do not fit. And he says in that article that your findings do not stand up to credibility. Have you attempted to refute Henry's conclusions? Because it seemed to, by what you just said before, that you would have to do that if you want to continue to claim validity for your own theories.
Well, let's take that up. First of all, I don't believe you've described accurately what Henry has done. In the second place, I don't think it is correct to describe the methods he applied as a rigorous modern methods. What Henry has done is to criticize my colleague Anna Schwartz and myself for not applying in a work published in 1982 statistical techniques that he published in 1983. Now, I plead guilty to that charge. Absolutely. Those techniques that he regards as the most advanced are experimental techniques that he has been producing that have not yet been subject to the criticism of other people in the field of econometrics, that are very far from being accepted techniques of analysis. Indeed, there was a recent conference in Boston under the auspices of the National Bureau of Economic Research in which one of the sessions dealt with the Henry papers. The commentators on that were severely critical of the techniques and methods he had used. Now, to go back, he did not examine the argument of our book. What he did was to say we attacked the wrong problem, we should have attacked a different problem, and that our results are not valid for the different problem. But we weren't talking about that problem. Moreover, his paper dealt with a very small part of the book. I have always felt that a book is like a child. I have a son. When he grew up, he went out into the world, he had to live his life. I wasn't going to spend my time defending every last bit of his. In the same way, when I've completed a book, I have allowed it to go out in the world. I want it to be subjected to scientific controversy. The answer to whether Henry's criticism is valid or not will not be given by me. It will be given by other econometricians who analyze his procedures, his methods, his work. So far, such analyses as I have seen of that kind suggest that he has not succeeded in his alternative method. He has, in supplementing his paper at the Bank of England, Mr. Henry attempted to apply his methods to produce what he regarded as a superior analysis of the data. The data he used were our data. He took them from our book. That analysis has not been, is subject, as it happens, to exactly the same criticisms as he levied against our analysis. But I agree with your fundamental point. If it turns out that his work demonstrates that our results are wrong, then our theory will have to be revised, of course. But he is very, very far from doing that as of the present moment.
Gentlemen, I would like to remind you just for a second, if to be as brief as humanly possible.
Yeah, I've just put one sentence following that, and that is that it seems to me a rather surprising view when you have published a very great work, which is one of the cornerstones of your contributions in recent years. And out comes one of the most noted econometricians in England today.
He isn't one of the most noted econometricians. I beg your pardon.
In England today.
Oh, in England, yes.
In England today. And then you say it is up to other people to prove that he is wrong. It's no concern of yours.
Of course it's a concern of mine. But science is a cooperative enterprise in which many, many people cooperate. I have published other books. I haven't spent my lifetime trying to answer every little criticism coming from anybody on that. Mr. Henry may well be one of the most effective econometricians in Britain, but Britain at the moment is a backwater in economics. The major location of econometric work is not Britain, it's the United States, and Mr. Henry is very far indeed from being one of the major econometricians in the world. Let's get things straight.
So what you're in effect saying is that the criticism which has been leveled against you by Professor Henry is really not significant enough for you to answer?
I'm saying two things. Number one, it is with respect to a kind of work that is not my specialty. I am not primarily an econometrician. I am an economist. We used one set of methods and techniques in our book. That set of methods and techniques produced results which I think will hold up, have held up, have not in any way been questioned by what Mr. Henry did. The techniques Mr. Henry used are of an altogether different kind. He used techniques that are highly experimental, that are extraordinarily complicated mathematically. I am not competent to analyze some of the things. That's not my field of specialization. And there are other people who are far more competent in that area. In the course of time, they will examine it. That's what I say. Science is a cooperative venture in which many people participate. It's not a single person. Einstein did not conduct the experiments that tested his theory. Should he have? Milton did so because his field was experimental physics. Einstein's field was theoretical physics.
Back to economics.
I think it's very important here to hear a comment on the major results of Mr. Henry and Ericsson, because they find out that the money demand function is not stable of the kind that you presume.
That is not what they found out. What they found out, what they argued, was something very different.
That's precisely what they say they found out.
Yes. But you have to
you disagree that they did find out?
Well, they didn't find that out at all. What they did was something else. Let me explain the situation. We were trying to separate out the movements from cycle to cycle, the longer-term trend. We deliberately tried to eliminate the intra-cycle movements. And
what kind of a time frame are we talking about when you talk about longer cycles?
We were talking, our book covers a period of over a century.
Right.
The individual units vary in length from about 1.5 or 2 years to about 4 or 5 years. So we're talking about half cycles.
Right.
The basic unit, you see a cycle consists of an expansion and a contraction. And our basic units are half cycles, either an expansion or a contraction. Mr. Henry's main criticism, main comment, this is why I say, he said we decided to go to New York and he thinks we should have gone to Boston. Because his main criticism is that we divided the data in this way, instead of treating all the data at once and trying to get one theory that would cover both the movements within the cycles and the movements between the cycles. When he asserts that we do not have a stable demand function for money, what he is saying is that his investigation, using the data continuously, not breaking it down as we did, he was unable to derive from that a function that would apply both within the cycles and between the cycles. And I don't regard that as a very surprising thing. I think the phenomena that occur within the cycles are of a rather different kind than those that occur from cycle to cycle.
Right, carrying on the discussion on economics, I think we have to be very brief, but you have a further point to make.
Yes. Are you then saying that you already knew it before you manipulated your data from the phase data, from the annual data to the phase data, that you knew that the demand function and the velocity function would be unstable?
No, excuse me.
No,
you have to.
First, you have to say. Did I hear you correctly? You said that Professor Friedman had manipulated
he had
data.
Transformed the annual data.
Of course, I manipulated the data.
Yes, for his cycles.
I don't doubt that I manipulated the data. Every statistician manipulates the data.
Okay.
The fellow who corrects a series. I have a series of data, and you're all acquainted with correcting them for seasonal variation. You can describe that as manipulating the data to eliminate the seasonal. So I'm not concerned about what
just to summarize
words you
in
use.
one
But
sentence.
I want to go to your point. What do you mean new? We always start out any study with some tentative hypothesis. We don't really know in any field. We start out with a tentative hypothesis, and we try to see if the data we're examining fit that hypothesis or contradict it. If they contradict it, we try to develop another hypothesis which is consistent with those data. So, of course, the reason we decided to try to separate out the intra-cycle movement from the intercycle movement was because we started with a tentative hypothesis that the demand function for money would be different within cycles, that the factors that would affect the quantity of money people hold in the short term would be different from the factors that would affect what they would hold in the long term. But let me emphasize, the problem of the demand, in our major book, in the book you're talking about, there are 2 chapters devoted to the demand curve function for money. There's also a very long chapter devoted to behavior of interest rates, which has not been involved in this at all. There's a chapter devoted to long cycles, which has not been involved in this. There's a chapter devoted to the relations between Britain and the United States, which has not been involved in this. So let me emphasize that we're talking about a very small part of a very big book.
Right. Yes, I know that. Brief comment, or shall we carry on to the political?
My point was that this type of transforming data from annual data to phase data was a novelty, was a new thing.
No.
When it was done, well, okay, it was not the regular thing.
I beg your pardon.
And my second point is that you choose the periodization of the model on the grounds of the monetary data, or didn't you?
No.
Or by some other method?
I do involve criticism of particular government episodes. For example, in our monetary history of the United States, I think we demonstrate very greatly that the Great Depression in the United States was largely a result of bad monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. But that's a historical observation about what actually went on. On the other hand, I have written a set of books, of which Capitalism and Freedom, Free to Choose, Tyranny of the Status Quo, all of which in association with my wife, are explicitly political. So that I regard my interest in politics as an avocation, not a vocation. I am primarily an economic scientist, I hope, and I think you will look long and hard in any of my scientific books to find the proposition you stated. It isn't in there. There's not a single word in any of those books that deals with the question of whether a big government is good, bad, or indifferent. That subject I have dealt with in the works which I regard as political. Okay, now let's turn to that.
But that's a correct reading of the political works
That's a
you've done.
correct reading of the political works. I'm not questioning that. I'm just trying to make the distinction.
Yes.
Because I think it's very easy for people to confuse the two and not to recognize that
Perhaps I should
there's a
have-
broad science of economics,
Perhaps I
which
should
is
have said-
non-political. I should explain to you.
Some of your
Take the monetary theory.
I just wanted to say that some of your followers in this country deliberately try to confuse your scientific criteria with.
Well,
with
they're
your
not here at the
political-
moment to
No.
answer for themselves.
Let me answer for me. I'll talk for
Yes,
me.
yes.
And let me point out to you that so far as my monetary theory is concerned, it has been followed in China, in communist China, as well as in capitalist Britain or capitalist Japan. The monetary theory in particular is a non-political theory. Karl Marx was a quantity theorist, so it really has no political content. On the other hand, the point you make is a valid point. I do believe that in and of itself, a large government sector is a factor which is adverse both to political freedom and economic prosperity. Now, the question of the circumstances under which a large government sector will do harm and how large it has to be to do harm depends very much on a number of considerations. One of those, a very important consideration, is the homogeneity of a society. A large government sector will do less harm in a relatively homogeneous society than it will in a heterogeneous society, because in a homogeneous society, people tend to want more or less the same thing, their values are much the same, and therefore that group of people can more readily agree on what government can do with less division from it. A second very important factor that is particularly relevant to countries like Iceland, like Norway, like Sweden, is the extent to which they are open economies, open to the rest of the world, and dependent on foreign trade. Both Norway and Sweden have been very largely open economies in which they have had a very large sector of international trade, as Iceland does. It's a very large international trade. And that means, with respect to that sector, government can't mess it up. There's a world market in which they operate. They are subject to international competition. It's interesting to note that in Sweden, where in the last 5 years or so, government has been much more involved than it was before in that sector, Sweden is having increasing economic difficulties. It's very far. There are very few people in Sweden today who would give the kind of universal approval to what's going on there that they gave 15, 20 years ago. Now you come to Norway. You left out of your description of Norway one very, very important fact. You know what that is. That's the discovery of oil. And of course, the discovery of oil in the North Sea is a bonanza which enabled. Saudi Arabia is not a democratic country. It's not a capitalist country. But it's a very rich country right now.
That's
why?
I agree
because
with
it
that,
found
yes.
oil. And
That's why you went
no
back to
doubt.
1960.
I went back to 1960.
But if you take it from
I'm talking
1960
about
on,
average.
if you take it from 1960 on, the fact of the matter is that the level of living in the United States, the level of output in the United States is distinctly higher than it is in Norway, has been all along. It is always very much easier for people to imitate than to innovate. It was much easier for Japan, for example, to have a much more rapid rate of growth in its early years because it started so far behind. A country which starts way behind the leading countries can have a more rapid rate of growth. You have to look at two things, not only the rate of growth, but the level of living. Now,
And if you take Norway for that, Norway has an extremely high level
Yes,
of
it
living.
does.
So
What was
it
the
isn't
standard in
starting from
1960 when,
scratch.
at the start of this point of discussion, where did the United States have to go from in 1960 and where did Norway have to go from in 1960?
That's true.
Isn't that
it
the
was
point?
higher at the time, but
It's still higher today.
it depends on years. Like if you take 1980, Norway was higher GNP
It depends on
per
exchange
capita.
rates.
Well, I mean,
It was
these
the
are the
fact
standard
that the-
measures. We apply these measures
Yes,
to all
I
the countries
understand.
in all the years,
I
so we
understand.
can draw the conclusions both ways.
Yeah.
And this actually proves the point that Norway has been above. But I just mentioned Norway to have one example. I could have mentioned other countries.
Yeah.
Sweden has a better record in many senses as well.
It does. It does.
Average levels of living and economic growth rates even slightly better. There's not a great
Well, let's
deal
look
of
at the facts.
difference.
Let's look at the facts. At the moment, as you quite rightly say, the average level of government spending in the United States is it's much too high in my opinion. It's about close to 35% of the GNP, over 40% of the national income. On the average in the continent of Europe, it's 50%. In the past 20 years, there have been 20 million new jobs created in the United States. Total employment has gone up by 20 million. The number of people employed on the continent of Europe today is lower than it was 15 years ago. In the past 18 months, there have been 6 million new jobs created in the United States. On the continent of Europe, there have been 0 new jobs. Unemployment today is as high as it was then or higher. So that it is pretty clear that what happens is if a country, you see, you have to ask which is a horse and which is a carriage. A wealthy country, a country that does well and performs very effectively, can afford a larger government than a country that does poorly. But as the size of the government increases, it becomes a handicap and a hindrance. And the question remains whether, if Norway permits the size of its government to continue to rise, it will or will not be a success. I think it will not.
I just want to make the point that I'm not saying that a big government is something we should ask for. I believe it would be ideal to have a small government, but my point is that the empirical facts actually go against your theory on this issue.
No, excuse me.
Well, you can't deny it because...
We have to look at all the empirical facts. Take a case, let me give you a counterexample. Here's Japan. In the 1960s, Japanese government spending as a fraction of income was roughly half of the United States. Its rate of growth was 10% a year. In the past 5 years, Japanese government spending has been rising rapidly relative to national income, and it's now as large as it is in the United States. And the rate of economic growth in Japan now is about 2%.
Yeah, but Japan is also a bad case for you because one of the things you have against government intervention, government regulation, is that it has the same negative effects. And Japan has a small public sector in the sense of taxation, relatively
not
small.
Any longer.
Well,
not
relatively small. But as regards regulation, the Japanese economy is a much more regulated economy than the United States one, but still they've done much better. A lot of the investment which goes into Japanese industry and research and development is channeled through public funds.
I think that's been greatly misunderstood and misconceived. MITI, the Ministry of Industry and Trade, makes great claims. If you look at the success stories in Japan, none of them have been through government. Sony was a private entrepreneur who did not get any government encouragement whatsoever. He built up Sony. Honda, I'm sure some of you drive Honda cars. Honda was not a government program. It did not get any government support. It has been a great success.
But what about the Mitsubishi Corporation?
The Mitsubishi enterprise was a major enterprise before the government entered in. If you take the Mitsubishi enterprises, the steel works did get government assistance. They are in great troubles now because there's a great overcapacity of steel around the world. The most prominent Japanese successes have been the ones where they've really made a dent, have been in electronics, television, automobiles. In all of those cases, it's been by individual entrepreneurs without, or in some cases against, the desires of MITI. Japan is a fascinating case. I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and the one thing I learned about Japan is any statement you can make about Japan which is true has an opposite statement which is equally true. If you say that the government plays a large role in business in Japan, you're right. If you say business plays a large role in government, you're right. If you say there's a large element of monopoly in Japan, you're right. If you say there's a large element of competition in Japan, you're right. For example, you know that Japan is almost the only country in the world that I know of where there are private highways conducted for profit. The railroads in Japan are part government, part private.
Well,
it's
Professor,
I
think Mr. Grimson wants to make a point.
Very interesting discussion because I think it illustrates very well the methodology which you usually employ.
Did you say methodology or mythology?
No, well, I could have said mythology because part of it is actually that. Because as you said yourself before, you draw a distinction between your scientific work, which some other scientists have been criticizing very heavily, although you have wanted to downplay that criticism in this discussion. And then there is another area of your work, which is sort of political theory, in which you participate in a general political debate, trying to advocate your ideas, not on a scientific basis, but on a general basis of competition between ideas. But there are a few countries where the governments have adhered to your recommendations and where one has a real life situation. And you said at the press conference here yesterday that in the first years in Chile, the government followed your recommendation and it got excellent results. And to many people who have heard of you as an advocate of freedom, it is a surprising paradox that a country where you have a military dictatorship, where a lot of people, even thousands of people, were imprisoned for their views and some killed, where human rights were almost completely abolished, where political parties were banned and there was no freedom of information or the press or so on, that in such a country of this nature, your theories can be a success.
Well, how do you explain the fact that in a country like China, which satisfies every one of your descriptions, those particular scientific theories have also been a success?
Well, I think that because there's some great similarity between some of the political system of China
and
some of the...
How do you explain the fact that in a country like Japan,
yes,
which it does not correspond to your description, the same theories have also been a success?
I can understand why you want to avoid to talk a bit about Chile. But
I'm glad to talk about Chile. I'm not trying to avoid it at all.
But let's talk about it in concrete terms.
Of course, be glad to.
Let us talk about it how it is. That,
let's talk about Chile in concrete terms. Let's talk about the fact that my participation in Chile... Can I explain first what my participation in Chile was? Because it seems to me that's highly relevant to this discussion. My participation in Chile has two parts. It has to do with the fact that the University of Chicago had a contract with the Catholic University of Chile before the period we're talking about, in which they sent students to Chicago to be trained. We sent people down there to help them in providing their education. And as a result, we trained at the University of Chicago many highly skilled economists who played an important part in economic policy. In the second place, in 1975, I spent exactly 7 days in Chile giving a series of lectures. You will be interested to know that one of those lectures was entitled "The Fragility of Freedom" and dealt with precisely the threat to freedom from a centralized military government.
No, but
you will also like to know that aside from those 7 days which I spent in Chile at that time, I have had no connection with the Chile government. I have never been an advisor to the Chile government. I have never refrained from criticizing the political system in Chile.
That's not the point.
Professor, I don't think that anybody wanted to imply that you were in any way responsible for the society in Chile.
You were responsible for people being killed. The point I was trying to make, but I would have made if you hadn't interrupted, was that you claim to be the theorist of freedom. When you're asked to give an advice in this country, you gave one word: freedom.
Right.
But at the same time, you are on record here in this country as saying that a country which is among the most severe military dictatorship in recent years applied your economic theories truthfully. And the point I just want to bring out, and it seems that you have now acknowledged it as being true, that your economic theories can be applied either in a rigorous dictatorship of the proletariat, like in China, or in a dictatorship by generals.
Look, are you going to say that the law of gravity is different in China and in Chile than it is in Iceland?
No,
All right, there are certain aspects of economics, as I explained before, which are scientific in character. The law, the quantity theory of money, is a scientific law. The statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon is a scientific law and not a political law. It is like Newton's law. If any country, whether it be a dictatorship, a democracy, whatever it may be, prints too much money, you're going to have inflation. If any country, whether it be a dictatorship or a democracy, wants to reduce inflation, it must reduce the amount of money it prints. Now, those are scientific laws. They have no political content, as I was explaining to you before. You can, whatever your political views are, look, I don't understand you. Are you saying that if you have certain political views, you should only use one kind of physics?
No, I'm just saying that there is, in the presentation of your views, no clear dividing line, as I think has become a success.
Well, how do you explain the fact that in a country like China, which satisfies every one of your descriptions, those particular scientific theories have also been a success?
Well, I think that because there's some great similarity between some of the political system of China
and some of the...
How do you explain
the fact that in a country like Japan, which it does not correspond to your description, the same theories have also been a success?
I can understand why you want to avoid to talk a bit about Chile. But
I'm glad to talk about Chile. I'm not trying to avoid it at all.
But let's talk about it in concrete terms.
Of course, be glad to.
Let us talk about it how it is. that...
Let's talk about Chile in concrete terms. Yes. Let's talk about the fact that my participation in Chile... Can I explain first what my participation in Chile was? Because it seems to me that's highly relevant to this discussion. My participation in Chile has two parts. It has to do with the fact that the University of Chicago had a contract with the Catholic University of Chile before the period we're talking about, in which they sent students to Chicago to be trained. We sent people down there to help them in providing their education. And as a result, we trained at the University of Chicago many highly skilled economists who played an important part in economic policy. In the second place, in 1975, I spent exactly 7 days in Chile giving a series of lectures. You will be interested to know that one of those lectures was entitled "The Fragility of Freedom" and dealt with precisely the threat to freedom from a centralized military government.
No, but
you will also like to know that aside from those 7 days which I spent in Chile at that time, I have had no connection with the Chile government. I have never been an advisor to the Chile government. I have never refrained from criticizing the political system in Chile.
That's not the point.
Professor, I don't think that anybody wanted to imply that you were in any way responsible for the society in Chile.
You were responsible for people being killed. The point I was trying to make, but I would have made if you hadn't interrupted, was that you claim to be the theorist of freedom. When you're asked to give an advice in this country, you gave one word: freedom.
Right.
But at the same time, you are on record here in this country as saying that a country which is among the most severe military dictatorship in recent years applied your economic theories truthfully. And the point I just want to bring out, and it seems that you have now acknowledged it as being true, that your economic theories can be applied either in a rigorous dictatorship of the proletariat, like in China, or in a dictatorship by generals.
Look, are you going to say that the law of gravity is different in China and in Chile than it is in Iceland?
No,
All right, there are certain aspects of economics, as I explained before, which are scientific in character. The law, the quantity theory of money, is a scientific law. The statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon is a scientific law and not a political law. It is like Newton's law. If any country, whether it be a dictatorship, a democracy, whatever it may be, prints too much money, you're going to have inflation. If any country, whether it be a dictatorship or a democracy, wants to reduce inflation, it must reduce the amount of money it prints. Now, those are scientific laws. They have no political content, as I was explaining to you before. You can, whatever your political views are, look, I don't understand you. Are you saying that if you have certain political views, you should only use one kind of physics?
No, I'm just saying that there is, in the presentation of your views, no clear dividing line, as I think has become apparent in your replies to the previous questions. No clear dividing line between your general political theories and what you call your economic theories. There is not a clear box of your economic theories and not a clear box for your political theories. And that is why I think many of the profit-making forces, the big business side, those who want to advocate less taxes so they have more money, have, if I may say so in all politeness, taken you on as a guru because they find this kind of mixture very convenient for them to propagate their own political theories and give it a kind of semi-scientific gloss.
I take it you think the automobile companies have approved my opposition to import quotas from Japan. I take it you think that the steel companies have approved my writings protesting vigorously against imposing tariffs on steel. You are quite wrong about big business taking me as a guru. When I say what they believe in, yes. When I say what they don't believe in, no. Now, let me go back to your fundamental question. And let's see if we can make a little order out of it. Every political question has several elements. One element is what objectives do you want to achieve? That's a value question. That's not scientific. That's a question of values. The second question is, what means do you use to achieve those objectives? Now, that's a scientific question. The question of whether, if you do such and such, it will have such and such effects is a scientific question. There are no pure, in your sense, there are no pure political questions that don't involve scientific issues. The question of whether you would like to travel, let's say if you're in the United States, whether you'd like to travel to New York, Chicago, that's a value question. The question of whether, in order to travel to New York or Chicago, you have to take a train or an airplane, that's a scientific question. So, of course, there cannot possibly be a complete separation between scientific questions here. The physicists who worked on the atomic bomb were applying scientific methods. The decision to use a scientific bomb was a political question, but that whole issue was a mixture of political and scientific issues. What I am trying to say is that certain parts of my work have been concerned with the scientific issue of what will be the consequences of doing certain things. Now, where I get political is when I come to the question of what do you want to do those things for? What is your objective? Look, if you want to produce inflation, as a scientist, I can tell you how to do it. From a policy point of view, I'll say you're making a mistake. It's a terrible thing to do. Don't produce inflation.
Can I then just ask you one question on that? I mean, what would you say about fixed exchange rates?
About fixed exchange rates?
Yes, and their effects on inflation.
I am opposed in general. As you know, I believe fixed exchange rates have had on the whole a very bad effect. So far as inflation is concerned, in the case of fixed exchange rates, so long as the exchange rates are fixed, any one country which inflates tends to export part of its inflation to other countries, and the inflation tends to occur throughout the fixed exchange rate regime. If a country does not have fixed exchange rates, if it has floating exchange rates, it is possible for one country to inflate while another country keeps stable prices. It was perfectly possible in the late 70s and 80s for Japan to have relatively low inflation, while the United States had fairly high inflation, while Israel had much higher inflation still. So that the difference between fixed and flexible exchange rates is that under a system of floating exchange rates, each country separately can control inflation within its own boundaries. Under a system of fixed exchange rates, it's a fixed exchange rate area.
You don't think inflation can be kept down by maintaining fixed exchange rates?
No.
And not by increasing the supply of money?
Excuse me. Inflation can be contained by not increasing the supply of money. If you have fixed...
No, but I said by increasing it.
You cannot combine... I'm sorry. If you have fixed exchange rates, you cannot also control the quantity of money. If you really stick to fixed exchange rates, you know, Keynes, in his famous book on monetary reform, published in 1923, pointed out in an appendix that you could have either stable exchange rates, either control over your exchange rates, or control over your internal price level and money supply. You could not have both.
Well, I'm very glad you said that, because on that point I agree with you completely.
I'm glad I have some point of
I think it has been one of my main criticism of the economic policies of the present government, that they are exactly based on these things which you have just said will not work in order to keep inflation down.
Mr. Grimson, as distinguished member of the opposition, is trying for an indictment.
We have had a great debate in this country about this.
What will keep inflation down is holding down the rate of monetary growth. If you hold down the rate of monetary growth, you will have relatively stable exchange rates.
What has been happening in Iceland is that the rate of monetary growth is not controlled, but it is increasing all the time, while the rate of inflation is going down. The exchange rate is kept fixed to the US dollar. Now, what Grimson is pointing out is that this policy cannot be, is not
the cure of inflation.
Unless the quantity of money, rate of monetary growth is held down.
Okay.
My understanding is that the rate of monetary growth has been reduced greatly.
Well, you've been partly informed, sir.
Well,
maybe. I don't know anything about it. Let me explain. I don't know anything about the details of the Iceland situation, but I will say that if you want to control inflation, there's one and only one way you ultimately have to do it, and that is by controlling the rate of monetary growth. Now, what is also true...
And not having fixed exchange rates.
Well, if you have... It depends on what you mean by fixed exchange rates. Most countries of the world now have sort of floating exchange rates.
This is completely fixed.
Yeah. But if you have fixed exchange rates, that will force you to hold down the rate of monetary growth. If you try both to have fixed exchange rates and to increase the monetary growth, one or the other will give. You cannot have both. I agree with you entirely.
Okay, if we can move away from that point.
Professor Friedman, if I could break in here. You say in your latest book, which you were written with Mrs. Friedman, Tyranny of the Status Quo, you say on page 73, I believe, something which startled me nicely, and I always like it when that happens. You say that the greatest threat to the security of the United States society is the welfare state. And you say also that it's even greater than the Soviet Union with all its nuclear weapons. In the light of the problems that your theory about the relationship between big government and economic outcomes, this would seem to us here in Europe, where we're used to very big welfare states, much more advanced than the United States one. This would seem like something of an exaggeration.
Well, maybe it may seem like an exaggeration, but I don't believe it is. Because what I meant by that, as I think I explained in the context, was that the pressures of the welfare state make it more and more difficult to have the funds available for maintaining a strong defense. That the willingness of the public to pay taxes is limited. That the total amount that the public will tolerate in the form of taxes tends to have some upper limit. Just where it is not clear. But it has an upper limit. That depends on circumstances in different countries. And that because the welfare state has a tendency to expand and expand, to call for more and more expenditures, it tends to impose upon the part of the budget which is available for national defense. And the sense in which I said that was a great threat was that if we did not curb the welfare state, we would be unable to get the amount of resources available for defense that was necessary to meet the threat of the Soviet Union.
Could I just take up another issue, slightly different?
Sure.
The question of equality.
Sure.
You come out against governments or anybody else trying to increase equality in the society from the distribution of income, say, that a free market system would give us. And there are, again, many reasons for your point on this. And but they come out differently when we talk about different groups, like when we talk about the rich and the poor. In your taxation policies, you recommend that we should lower the tax rate on high incomes. And your reason for that is that this will give the rich more incentive to work harder,
no, that is
and
not
also
my reason.
also to save.
That's not my reason. Excuse me, you're attributing to me the reason of somebody else.
The reason of lowering taxes on the rich are then what?
Oh, it's not to give them more incentive to save. It's not to give them more incentive to work. The reason for reducing the tax rates at the top is to reduce the incentive to invest their savings in unproductive ways. The fact is that with those high rates, now what you do is get tax shelters, which may be the wrong place to put your funds. I don't expect the rich to work any harder because you're going to lower the tax rate, but I do expect that the work they engage in will be directed more efficiently and will produce greater benefits for the rest of the population. I think it's disgraceful in the United States that we should have so many thousands of able people devoting full time of their efforts to trying to help other people avoid taxes. We have too many tax lawyers, too many tax accountants.
Excuse me, Stefan, before you make your point, I would like to remind you, gentlemen, that we are presently going to run out of time, and therefore we have to be very brief on these closing moments of this discussion. Stefan.
Sure. Well, this is a very important issue because you always tie the issue of equality to efficiency and the incentive to work. You don't deny that.
Excuse me, not solely the incentive to work.
No, but could I just go on? This also applies to your criticism of welfare measures, unemployment benefits, minimal wages, and so on. There you are worried about the the loss of incentive to work, that people actually become lazy, lose their interest in working hard, trying to move on, and thereby contribute to society, and also stimulate economic growth, because that all ties together. So the conclusion of your point on this is that the more forced equality we have, the less success, the less work you get, and the less economic growth rates. If we look to Iceland, which is only one empirical example I could mention which actually disproves it, there are many others. In Iceland we have a relatively equal distribution of income and level of living, but still we're one of the hardest working nations in the world. Our average working week is amongst the highest. So this would definitely disqualify your theory, which ties together equality and efficiency. There's also empirical research which the brilliant economist Professor Lester Thurow at MIT has cited in a recent paper, where he shows that if you tax high income groups, it does not lead to a lesser incentive than otherwise. In fact, it may lead them to try harder and thereby contribute more to society, which is the opposite outcome that...
Briefly, I said, Stefan, briefly.
Yes, this is the opposite outcome that we would expect from your theory.
Well, you've raised a lot of different issues. As I emphasized, my main argument about the tax system is that I would like to have a tax system which does not distort the incentives of people with respect to how they use their labor and with respect to how they invest their capital. It's much more the distorting effect that I'm concerned about than it is the overall incentive effect that you were talking about. With respect to the poor, there is no doubt that in the United States, the existence of the welfare system changes the incentives of the poor in ways that I regard as adverse. I don't blame the poor people for that. They are foolish if they don't take advantage of the program. But as you may know, I think there is an enormous difference between 90% of us saying we want to help the bottom 10% and 80% in the middle saying we're going to take money from the top 10% to give it to the bottom 10%, most of which in the way drops off in between on the 80% and doesn't get down to the bottom.
But you do not
I am in favor of a society. I am in favor of a society of equal opportunity. And I say that as a matter of empirical fact, such a society will in fact produce greater equality than a society which seeks to impose equality.
Well,
now, if we come to the case of Iceland, circumstances affect things. I don't know the detailed situation in Iceland. What you say may well be true. But much depends on the character of the people, on the background, on the kind of welfare measures you have. I don't know what welfare measures you have. I don't know how much redistribution of income you have. The question is, do you have equality? Because you have a highly homogeneous population that has lived together for a long time and that has been able to achieve a relative degree of equality? Or do you have equality because it has been imposed upon you through a welfare state? I don't know what the answer is.
But there are other equal societies
just
the
one
same
briefly,
applies
since
to,
time
you
is
see.
sort of running short.
Sure.
Is it a correct summary?
Allow me to examine in detail the particular cases you're dealing with. I might very well come out with those conclusions. Maybe I wouldn't. With respect to the drug case, the drug control, that I think you have a great deal of evidence in many different countries. And in my opinion, prohibiting drugs does far more harm than good, regardless of what your moral views are on it. I know in the United States, half the crime in our cities comes from the drug trade, and we would have a lot less crime. We tried it with prohibition and it didn't work. If you really are interested in saving the lives of people, if that's your main objective, then you obviously ought to prohibit both smoking and drinking. In the United States, smoking and drinking cause far more deaths than either drugs or any of these other things you're talking about. Now, I am not in favor of that.
That's not a moral stand.
It is a moral. No, that's a practical stand.
That's a practical
But my
stand.
moral stand is that I believe that people should be free to commit suicide. If a friend of mine drinks or smokes, I think he's making a mistake. I will try to persuade him not to do it. But I don't think I have the right to force him not to do it.
Right.
So I am on moral grounds opposed to prohibition. However, I go on to say that those moral grounds are reinforced by the pragmatic grounds that trying to prohibit it doesn't work.
You're also opposed to
brief comment from you, then from the other two.
Yes, and then you're also opposed to the free education of children.
I am opposed to, well, we have to be very careful there, because I've written extensively on that, and my views are, I am opposed in the United States to government education of children. I am opposed to having the schools run by the state. I have been in the past and in favor of government assurance that every child, regardless of his income or his background, be able to get schooling. But that doesn't involve running the schools. I've been in favor in the United States of something called a voucher system, under which parents would be free to choose what schools their children go to. And in that sense, first of all, there is no free education. What do you talk about free? You mean nobody pays for it?
I'm talking about a child of the worker having the same chance to get education as a child of the rich man.
He should have the same chance.
And I'm talking we should not have have that kind of system in education as we are having now here in Iceland with your lecture, that the worker would have to work for 2 days in order to get into it, whereas the big businessman can just charge it on his account in the company to get in. Because we do not start out. We do not start out from the same position.
Of course not.
No.
I didn't start out from the same position you did.
No, exactly.
I was lucky to be born in the United States. You were lucky to be born in Iceland. We started out from different positions. But those societies that have tried to carry out the views you're now expressing are the societies of misery, of tyranny, of slavery. The ideas you're expressing are the ideas that were expressed by the leaders of the Soviet Union. They were the ideas that were expressed by the leaders of China. They are the ideas that have been expressed in every country that has sought to go down the direction you're describing, has ended up with tyranny and misery. You have in those states greater inequality in practice between the top and the bottom than you have.
Are you really trying to tell me that the Icelandic system of the child of the worker getting the same education as the child of the rich businessman is Soviet communism?
No, I am not.
Or even will lead to it?
No, I am not saying that. I'm saying something different. I'm saying the principle you expressed, that there's something wrong about some people having higher incomes than others. That there's something wrong about somebody you call a rich man being able to...
Starting out in life.
Well, whether he starts out in life or not. But there's something wrong.
That's the essential thing.
There is no way you can make people equal at their start. What you can do is to give them equal opportunities. You cannot in any way make the child who is born blind equal to the child who is not born blind. You can try to compensate for that, but you cannot start people out equal. And what I am saying is that the principle you're expressing, that there is something wrong with some people ending up at a higher income level than other people.
I'm saying starting out with.
There is no way people can start out the same.
Of course there is.
And
there can be equal opportunity. I think we've progressed as far as we can with this.
Equal opportunity is what we want. We want everybody to have the same opportunity to take advantage of whatever qualities he has. Some people will accidentally be born with higher qualities. Some people will be lucky in the choice of country they're born in. Some people will be lucky with the parents they get.
But who would pay the vouchers that you mentioned?
Who would pay the vouchers? That's where I went back. It's one thing to have 90% of the people impose taxes on themselves to help the other 10%.
So in effect, people would be paying themselves because this would be the 90%. Yes.
Right. It's a very different thing. And this is where the alternative, to have 80% in the middle, try to impose heavy taxes on these people in order to benefit themselves or the people lower down.
Right. If there's a brief comment on anything we've just been discussing, obviously we cannot raise new issues here, then the floor is yours.
Well, I would just like to mention one thing in this connection. That's about inflation.
Sure.
Professor Topin has calculated or estimated the cost of the U.S. Lack of work now, unemployment, and excess production capacity of about $500 billion. Is that an overestimation?
What was the cost of the unemployment caused by the inflation?
Well, that was much less.
Was it?
This was the net figure he stated.
No, I beg your pardon. If I remember the calculation you were speaking of, it was an estimate he made some years ago of what would in fact be the cost, not of what it actually has been. And you must realize that in country after country, as inflation has risen, unemployment has gone up, not down. Inflation temporarily reduces unemployment, but after a period, it increases it.
I think you're wrong, because in the countries we have just mentioned that is the most splendid monetarist case, the United Kingdom, you have been trying to control money supply and been rather successful, and still employment is increasing. And because